Unit 7, Urbanization. Two content objectives for this slide notes. Content objective 7.1, explain factors that influence the growth and location of cities. Content objective 7.2, explain how the structure of cities around the world vary. Aligning with Content Objective 7.1, explain factors that influence the growth and location of cities. Your I-CAN statements are 1. Define services, 2. Explain how clustering of services creates urbanization growth, and 3. Outline how the central place theory depicts the optimal location for a service. Services, what are they? There are several types of services. However, a service is an activity that is consumed by somebody that gives money in return. They are linked to development when we look at services. So we go back to DTM stages. Most services will be found in stage 3 or 4. Or we can also tie it to our previous chapter when we talked about economic sectors within development. Economic sectors on that continuum going from primary to secondary to tertiary, or advancement in economic growth, as we learned with both of those models. So today when we talk about services, we know that countries that have more services making connections are going to be more developed. And that means MDCs have more services and have more income to buy services. We look at the distribution of services on a global scale. We can see that, again, these patterns follow development patterns, where you have more development, a higher life expectancy, a lower crude birth rate, a lower crude death rate, a lower natural increase rate, also higher urbanization rates. We see more services and more services consumed with expendable income. And where we see services not prevalent is where we see demographic measurements that are low in CBR, CDR, NIR, infant mortality rate, high fertility rates. So we know that these areas, and we also learned in agriculture that these areas are primarily subsistent farmers. In some regions, as high as 50%. The growth of services. The growth of services we can see over time have increased from the span of 1975 to the end date of 2009. And as we look forward in the future, we can see that this trend will likely tick upward as well. Where are services located today? More than half are found in urbanization or urban areas. Urbanization has rapidly grown since the Industrial Revolution, so we could go back to industry. And the Industrial Revolution propelled urbanization. We look at MDCs where over 3/4 of the population resides in urban areas, and we compare it to LDCs where less than half, 40%, are found in urban areas. So the majority of the population lives in rural, undeveloped areas. Both MDCs and LDCs have large cities, however, and we'll talk about that later. We look at urbanization. Again, these rates follow the patterns of development. So it's easy to remember this information when you connect it to all previous units. When we look at, when we talk about Unit 1 and we look at regions that are more formal regions, we can see the formal regions are found in more developed countries that have geometric boundaries that shows their resource and political control occupation of land. That also coincides with high urbanization rates. However, we also learned that in development that one of the less developed countries that is very different than other less developed countries is South America, because they had high urbanization rates, which was one of the factors that was an optimistic factor for economic development and overall development. Walter Christaller came up with the central place theory in the 1930s. The idea was to find the optimal location for a service business. States, they would compete. There was competition, which led to a regular pattern of settlement. And that pattern of settlement provides four different sizes of settlements, with the smallest being a hamlet, and the second largest being a village, and the third a town, and then eventually a city. And when we look at the central place, the market center will always be in the middle, as you can see with the dots, for each of those sizes of settlements. And then the area of that hexagon within each size of settlement shows us the market area, or also known as the hinterland, the area of where consumers will buy the service. We look at the market areas across the entire United States, and we can see the market areas really follow a pattern of large cities. So we can assume that, based on this map, or we can make the prediction that the larger the settlement, the larger the hinterland, or the market area. All right, market areas vary by service. Christaller came up with two ways of looking at market areas. One, he looked at range. It's the distance people are willing to travel to consume. And now when we look at people willing to travel to consume, it's not so much distance in miles traveled in more developed countries, it's more distance in time. Very different than in less developed regions, because in less developed regions it isn't time. It's more, it more pertains to distance one has to travel. And the range will depend on the cost and availability of a service, and also the specialization of a service. The more specialization, the higher the cost, and the less the availability, and then thus the larger range. And thresholds, the number of people that support the service. In other words, the number of people that have the income to buy the consumer service. And again, this will vary based on level of purchasing power parity, or what's also known as income, expendable income. And it will vary by age of the demographics and also the preference of the consumer. And remember what we learned about development, culture rather, is that most consumers will be purchasing pop cultures that come from MDCs, and they'll have the highest purchasing power parity. They will consume the most consumer services. This data can be used to, when we use both these pieces or concepts, the range and threshold, we can determine the profitability of a service location. In which Minnesota county would you build the following? What kind of maps might you use? And go ahead and click the link and decide which of these services would you build in Minnesota, and what would be the range, and what would be the threshold, and what would be the location, and what would be the size of settlement, hamlet, village, town, city, or county. How can you determine the optimal location? Just think of it this way. The shortest distance, you want to attract the largest number of people. Second content objective. Explain factors that influence the growth and location of cities. Your I can statements demonstrate how the central place theory by Walter Christaller determines the different sizes of settlements. Secondly, describe how the rank size rule explains the distribution of services in rural and urban areas. Going back to the central place theory, we talked about the sizes of settlements as illustrated in the map to the right and down below the key showing you the size of settlements. It's linked to market area. The fewer the general rules of thumb. Few large settlements and many small settlements. And the sizes are hamlets, villages, and towns. They form hexagons, and they have a nesting pattern, meaning there's no overlapping of the hexagons, so there's a continuous service. And when we look at less developed countries, they're going to always have very large settlements, and they're going to have many, many smaller settlements. Whereas in more developed countries, they're going to have fewer large settlements, and they're going to have more smaller settlements in size. So more smaller settlements in the four sizes of villages and towns and small cities. When we look at ranking settlements, there's the rank size rule. The settlement size follows a very regular pattern. The nth city is 1/nth the population of a large city, meaning if you have the largest city is 5 million people, the second largest city will be half of 5 million people, and that'll be 2.5 million people. And then the third largest city will be half of 2.5 million people. And that will follow the rank size rule. This is very important when we look at this pattern. This will help us tell us the level of development. If a country follows the rank size rule, that tells us it's very developed, because everyone in every size settlement is able to buy basic needed services, such as food, such as access to water, such as gas, such as mobility for a paying job. If there are countries that do not follow the rank size rule, most will follow, not all, will follow the primate city rule. That means the largest city is more than twice the size of the second largest city. Some of these primate cities are found in very developed regions of the world, such as France and the United Kingdom, but most are found in less developed countries, or what are known as megacities. Fast-growing cities in areas where we learned about in Unit 2, population, that 95% of the population growth, NIR, is in less developed countries. So when that growth is happening, the urban areas are growing exponentially, thus creating the service settlement rule of primate city. How do periodic markets provide goods and services? Well, they provide markets in various rural settlements that alleviate some of the problems primate cities might have. So access to necessary foods, or access to necessary crafts, or basic necessities. The rank size rule, we can see the United States follows the rank size rule, so we know that there's equal distribution of basic and non-basic services throughout all the United States, whether they're in whether in a major city, or whether they're in a smaller city, or whether they're in a village or a town. All right, rank size rule. Rank size rule can be seen even in states or subdivisions of states, such as Minnesota. We see Minnesota roughly following the rank size rule with the populations of the 5 largest cities. And then we also look at Canada, and they roughly follow the rank size rule, not as closely as Minnesota. So we can see that in some of the largest cities in Canada as an entire country, there might be rural areas that don't have access to some basic services.